As we come to the end of this decade, I'd like to take a moment to reflect on decades past. See, decades have this problem of not really ending when they're over, and I don't mean in the overly pedantic way where people go, well, the decade doesn't start till 21. Shut up. No, I mean culturally, decades tend to take a year or two to take off. Nirvana and Jurassic Park were essential to 90s pop culture, and the 9/11 attacks loomed large over the 2000s. In fact, of the last century or so, when we really started breaking culture up by the decade, the only decade that really ended on time was the 60s. See, 1968 and 1969 put a full halt on everything the decade had built up, and thoroughly set the stage for what would be the 1970s. And for nearly every big social event, there was a movie to go along with it. These are the movies that ended the 60s.
And go like this.
We gotta start thinking beyond our guns. Those days are closing fast.
The 60s is perhaps the most important decade in film history. They really pushed the boundaries of what was acceptable in films. The decade got off to a violent start with Psycho, Peeping Tom, and Eyes Without a Face, and it would only grow more profane from there. At the time, the American film industry was under the Hays Code, a set of rules dictating what could and couldn't be shown in movies. But these were rules from the 30s, and were starting to feel a little out of date by the decade of Vietnam and free love. Soon they had started rolling back the rules. Fewer restrictions on gore, on nudity, on sexuality, black men kissing white women, pure chaos. It also didn't help that this was a pass-fail system, meaning, at least in the eyes of the MPAA, a film like Mary Poppins was exactly as appropriate as Bonnie and Clyde. This is not a system that would work. So in 1968, the MPAA enacted the ratings system we know today. It was a little different. The ratings were G for general, M for mature, R for restricted, and X for porn. Okay, that's not totally accurate, but we'll get to that. This new rating system gave directors freedom they didn't previously have. Suddenly films were unrestricted, and they used that power. There are a lot of films I could have picked to represent this change in dynamic, but I went with Sam Peckinpah's The Wild Bunch, because 50 years later, film historians still point to this as one of the most violent films of all time. Without the new rating system, this film could never have been released. But I didn't just pick this movie because it's violent, it's actually an incredibly important part of action film history. Peckinpah used quick cuts, different angles on action, and even varying speeds in a way that hadn't really been done before. The old-style westerns were a bit slower, with only a few moments of action. Peckinpah had practically redefined the action genre. Action is fascinating as compared to other genres because it didn't exist before movies the way horror or comedy did. Action had to evolve into existence. And I would make the very strong case that Wild Bunch was the next step in its evolution. After Wild Bunch, action movies began being more fast-paced and utilizing the editing techniques in the film. The 70s and 80s would be the decades that gave us many notable examples of the genre. But while Wild Bunch had breathed new life into action, it couldn't quite do the same for westerns. In the film, a bunch of old outlaws get together in the early 1900s and reminisce about the disappearing Wild West. So, looking forward to a world where they had no place, the gang decides to go out on a blaze of glory. It was almost meta. The westerns had been a staple of American cinema since at least the late 40s, and even before that, The Great Train Robbery was one of the first films ever. But by the late 60s, the genre was on its last leg. Maybe it was fatigue from an oversaturated market, maybe it was America's increasing disenfranchisement with its own history. Either way, the genre was dying. So, in a blaze of glory it went. The Wild Bunch, a fast, explosive, violent end to an era, and a passionate introduction to a new kind of Wild West. Films unfiltered by the Hays Code.
In the town where I was born, lived a man who sailed to sea.
Yellow Submarine is a film from 1968 based on music by the Beatles. Noteworthy, however, unlike many other Beatles movies, the Beatles weren't actually played by themselves. Since the film was animated, the iconic quartet was voiced by other people. But I say it's noteworthy that the Beatles weren't in their final screen appearance because, in 1969, the Beatles broke up. Of course, their final album, Let It Be, wouldn't come out until a year later, but by that point they had all moved on. John Lennon didn't even come in to record their final song. The influence of the Beatles over the musical scene of the 60s could not possibly be overstated. They are, by all accounts, the biggest band of all time. The only people in the same league as them are Elvis and Michael Jackson. But Elvis and Michael Jackson could go on making music until they died. The Beatles had 4 members. Take one away and it's not really the Beatles. Take all of them away and you have one of the biggest upsets in pop culture history. And yet the Beatles broke up at exactly the right time. Not only were they at their artistic peak and never had to suffer the decay bands who go on too long do, I think it was necessary for us to move on to the future. The Beatles were a big part of hippie culture, and the hippies were about to take a huge hit. On top of the group loss of the Beatles, hippies would lose a bunch of musicians in a much more permanent way. In exactly 2 years, from July 1969 to July 1971, Brian Jones, Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, and Jim Morrison would all die. All of them were 27, and all of them died of drug-related issues. The loss of so many noteworthy acts would be a blow for any culture. But it wasn't over for the hippies yet. One of the big things hippie culture was against was the Vietnam War, which had been raging since 1955. Yet, after nearly a decade of protesting, they were no closer to ending it. The Vietnam War was one of the few ongoing issues of the 60s that would continue well into the 70s. Hippie music did get its last hurrah. From August 15th to August 18th, Woodstock, a festival promising 3 days of peace and music, would serve as the final push of the hippie movement to end the war. Of course, it didn't, and while the hippies and their ideas are still around, they would take a huge backseat to other, bigger counterculture movements. But it wasn't just the failure to end the war that made hippies so unpopular. Just a week before Woodstock, the movement would take a blow that it could never recover from.
A wandering band of members of a so-called religious cult, with a leader they called Jesus, has had 3 of its followers arrested in the investigation of the murder of Sharon Tate and 6 others.
Hippies were a movement born out of disenfranchisement with America and consumerist culture. But by the late 60s, that disenfranchisement had started to turn inward. Eventually, some hippies decided the best mindset would be,
the whole world must learn of our peaceful ways. By force.
Probably the biggest example of this is the Manson family murders. The crimes of Charles Manson and his followers have been obfuscated by mythology and pop culture, so let me give you a brief recap. Charles Manson was a big figure in hippie culture, starting his own commune on the Spawn Ranch in LA, where a lot of cowboy shows and movies were filmed. The ranch was largely abandoned at the time, and Manson began converting people to his anti-capitalist, drug-heavy lifestyle. But Manson's rhetoric turned violent fast. Manson was convinced black people would rise up against white people, leading to the annihilation of white people, except the Manson family, who would then rule their own city? Don't dwell on it, Manson was a nutjob. He became increasingly convinced the Beatles' White Album was a coded message about this uprising, and long story short, sent his followers to kill a bunch of big-name celebrities in hopes of inspiring an uprising. The most well-known of these murders was the murder of actress Sharon Tate, and several of her friends in the home of Roman Polanski, who was married to Tate at the time. The Manson murders were hardly the only violent moment in the final days of the hippies, they were just the biggest. It really left a bad taste in everyone's mouth. The hippies faced enormous pushback from the very beginning, as most counterculture movements do, and the fact that they couldn't even practice what they preached caused a lot of people to completely lose faith. But with one style of counterculture dying, another was already forming, and it would, fascinatingly, serve as the soundtrack to Charles Manson's favorite movie. Easy Rider tells the story of 2 bikers, Wyatt and Billy, and their motorcycle trip across the USA. Along the way, they meet a lot of counterculture types and face some heavy backlash just for being who they are. Billy and Wyatt are presented as hippies, but they're tough biker guys as well, in a combination that makes them a lot of enemies.
Oh, they're not scared of you. They scared of what you represent to them. Hey, man. Oh, we represent to them, man, as somebody who needs a haircut. Oh, no. What you represent to them is freedom.
It's a strange, almost spiritual film. It would take longer to dissect this film than it would to just watch it, and there are people far better suited to discuss it than I am. But it flawlessly bridges the gap between the hippie movement and the heavy metal movement of the early 70s. The soundtrack to this film was performed by Steppenwolf, an early entry in the newly formed genre of heavy metal. In fact, their song, Born to Be Wild, featured prominently in this movie, is credited with inventing the term heavy metal. Of course, these days the term heavy metal refers to acts a little heavier than Steppenwolf. Iron Maiden and Judas Priest have become staples of the genre, while the old stuff has sort of been redefined as hard rock. But in the day, this was the heaviest shit there was. Steppenwolf wouldn't really have much major contribution to the heavy metal scene outside of the songs in this film, but two much bigger acts were dropping their first albums. In 1968, Deep Purple released their debut album, Shades of Deep Purple, and just a year later, Led Zeppelin would release Led Zeppelin 1 and 2. These two bands, along with Black Sabbath, who debuted a year later, would form what came to be known as the unholy trinity of British heavy metal. And the tough, biker, hippie thing would be the aesthetic of early heavy metal. We want the war to end, but angrier this time. This is also where we start to see a more distinct break between pop music and rock music. They were more distinct from their jazzy R&B roots. Motown started to get more recognition, due at least in part to black people finally being taken seriously as artists. Their success would lead to one of the biggest music fads of the 70s, disco, though that was still a few years off at this point. But you know who Motown did introduce to the world in 1969? A little group called the Jackson Family 5, fronted by a young Michael Jackson, who would go on to be the second highest selling musician in history. That has nothing to do with Easy Rider, it's just another big thing that happened in '69. And it was another push past the old hippie days. Circling back to Manson, he's been open about Easy Rider being his favorite movie, and I can kind of see why. There is a spiritual hippie vibe to it. Interestingly, about a year before Charles Manson had attacked Roman Polanski's wife and unborn child, Polanski was making a movie all about a cult attacking a woman and her unborn child.
Hail Satan!
Hail Satan!
Satan is his father, and his name is Adrian. He shall overthrow the mighty and lay waste their temples. He shall redeem the despised and wreak vengeance in the name of the burned and the tortured.
Rosemary's Baby is easily the most well-known film from acclaimed director and convicted rapist Roman Polanski. The film follows Mrs. Rosemary Woodhouse, a married woman who's just gotten pregnant. But strange things are going on. It soon becomes clear some sort of cult wants Rosemary's Baby. But for what purpose? And more importantly, who is in this cult? A lot of tension in Rosemary's Baby comes from just not knowing how big the cult is and which characters are involved. It really feels like you can't trust anyone. In 1968, Richard Nixon defeated Herbert Humphrey by a somewhat large margin for the office of president. He was sworn in January 1969 and would serve 4 years and win a second election before stepping down in 1974 to avoid impeachment. The Nixon administration has become infamous over the Watergate scandal. In 1972, 5 men were caught robbing the Democratic National Committee headquarters, and an investigation began linking the robbery to several high-profile government officials. Just like in Rosemary's Baby, it was unclear at the time who all was involved, and, in a shocking twist, it went all the way to the top. Maybe it's a stretch to say this was an event from 1969 since the meat of it happened 5 years later, but who had a bigger impact on the 70s? Ford, Carter, or Nixon? I think this still ties into my thesis. Maybe the big event hadn't happened yet, but the stage had been set.
Each moment in history is a fleeting time, precious and unique. But some stand out as moments of beginning, in which courses are set that shape decades or centuries.
And a lot of big events were still going on. A lot of big political events.
Everybody's talking at me. I don't hear words they're saying.
Midnight Cowboy tells the story of Texas boy Joe Buck, played by Jon Voight, who moves to New York City to become a prostitute. There he meets and befriends Rizzo, played by Dustin Hoffman, and moves into his squalid apartment. Buck quickly finds prostitution doesn't pay what he thought it did, but he needs money to help with his friend's deteriorating health. So he turns to prostituting for men. The sexual aspects of this film were controversial at the time, and thus it received an X rating by the MPAA. It was later re-rated to R, but at the time homosexuality was very, very frowned upon. Which takes us to real New York City. Same time, same place as the movie. Very few places were accepting of homosexuals, and those that were often pretty underhanded. The Stonewall Inn was owned by the Mafia, and it was the best place for a poor queer person to be. Most customers were poor or abandoned by their families, and it was one of the most racially diverse bars in the city. And yes, there were quite a few male prostitutes. Police raids on the bar were common, both to seize alcohol and arrest men in drag. Also, strangely, women were required to wear 3 pieces of feminine clothing or get arrested. I don't know what counts as feminine clothing, nor why they were enforcing that, because there is no law stating that. Generally, there were tip-offs that the cops were coming, and they'd happen early enough to not impede the night's business. That didn't happen the night of June 27th. Allegedly, the bar owners weren't up on their police bribes, so around 1 a.m. the police showed up unannounced. Many of the patrons out that late had never been in a police raid before and weren't sure what to do. Several were released with no arrest and, instead of going home, congregated outside the bar, drawing more people and attention to the ongoing police raids. Soon they began chants of gay pride and gay power, jeering the police. It escalated to flipping a cop car and throwing coins at police. And then, someone threw a brick. This had gone from an atypical police raid to a full-scale, 2-day-long riot in the streets of New York. It was the biggest moment the gay rights movement had had up to that point. It shined a light on the size and support of the gay community. To this day, we celebrate LGBT pride in late June, in remembrance of the Stonewall riots. I say remembrance as if anyone talks about this. It's an event that's sort of been scrubbed from the popular conscious. I mean, I didn't even learn about it in school, I just had to hear about it from someone who actually cared about queer history. And revisionism like this doesn't help. You nailed it, Google, this is exactly what Pride 69 looked like. LGBT identities would start to become more widely accepted starting in the 70s, thanks in large part to this riot. And to movies like Midnight Cowboy, putting these people in the public eye. And as one civil rights campaign found its dawn, another came to its end.
Johnny!
You're still afraid.
Stop it now, I mean it.
They're coming to get you, Barbara.
George A. Romero's Night of the Living Dead debuted in 1968, and it's one of the greatest and most important films of all time. To start, it invented the zombie apocalypse. Zombies existed long before Night of the Living Dead, but they were just undead slaves of witch doctors and voodoo practitioners. The zombies in Night of the Living Dead were independent, an army of undead who fed on human flesh. Nothing like that had existed before. But more importantly, it was the first movie to star an African American in a role not deliberately written for an African American. According to Romero, he didn't intend for the character to be black, but Dwayne Jones was the best actor who auditioned. But he inadvertently made his point a lot stronger. The running theme across the Living Dead trilogy is how quickly barriers break down when we're in bad situations. It doesn't matter if you're white or black, a man or a woman, or whatever you are. I want to survive, and you want to survive. And we're a lot better at surviving when we work together. And when people in these movies work together, things go well. When people don't work together, when they get greedy, when they power trip, when they do what's best for them and no one else, things turn bad very quickly. So this wasn't a deliberate message of desegregation, but it certainly lends itself to that reading. The ending, however, is very deliberately about the black struggle. The final scene was a suggestion by Jones, and it stands as one of the most shocking and meaningful moments in the entire trilogy, if not horror movies in general.
Let's go check out the house. There's something there. I heard a noise.
Hey, spoilers for Night of the Living Dead. It's public domain, so you can just watch it for free. You've been warned.
All right, Vince, hit him in the head, right between the eyes.
America is shocked and saddened by the brutal slaying tonight of Dr. Martin Luther King. I ask every citizen to reject the blind violence that has struck Dr. King.
On April 4th, 1968, black civil rights leader Martin Luther King was shot at the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, Tennessee. He was rushed to the hospital, but he died within the hour. Unlike Stonewall, I probably don't have to explain Martin Luther King Jr. to you. He is the most famous figure of the black civil rights movement. His marches, boycotts, sit-ins, and speeches were foundational in the effort to desegregate America. But a lot of historians point to his death as one of the most powerful moments in his life. MLK died a martyr's death. From a moment of crisis, we tore down the barriers between us. By the end of 1969, desegregation was in full effect. While efforts to desegregate had been in process for most of the 60s, notably with the 1964 Civil Rights Act, the movement had still struggled to gain any sort of equality. MLK didn't end racism. Even the civil rights movement he led couldn't do that. But he did help dismantle a great many policies that our government was using to keep them down, and raise the public consciousness of the plight of colored people. And in the end, they made life better, not just for people like Dwayne Jones, but for all of us. Because we survive better when we work together. Okay, enough of the bummers. Let's talk about something cool the government did. Based on the book by Arthur C. Clarke and brought to life by Stanley Kubrick, 2001: A Space Odyssey revolutionized special effects with its crazy outer space sequences. To compare the movie to the book is a bit unfair, as while the two follow a similar story, the film was clearly going for a much different thing. It's a speculative sci-fi venture for sure, but its use of music and visuals gives it an almost ballet-like quality. But quite pertinently to the topic at hand, it depicts a future where, by the year 2001, we would have regular space travel and a base on the moon. Now, I'm writing this 18 years after 2001, so we know that future never happened. But in the 60s, that future wasn't too far-fetched. See, we were in this Cold War with Russia, and at some point we decided we needed to prove who was the smartest. Thus began the space race. I guess the moon was the final destination. Maybe they intended to go further, but we landed on the moon and it sort of died out. So through the 60s, there was a sudden and rapid advancement of space travel and exploration, and it all culminated in July of 1969.
That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
On July 20th, 2 American men landed on the moon. You're probably more than aware of this, though you might not have known when it happened. 1969, the year we won the space race. We sent 6 more missions to the moon over the next 4 years, but after 1972 we wrapped it up. We never achieved the future Kubrick and Clarke saw, but it certainly impacted us culturally.
Once the astronauts went up, children only wanted to play with space toys.
Space movies like 2001 would become big in the 70s. 69 would see the conclusion of the original Star Trek, one of the biggest sci-fi television series ever, and they would make a series of films stretching to the current day starting in the 70s. Of course, Star Wars and Alien came out as well, though rather late in the decade. And I think, on top of our heightened interest in space exploration, 2001 had a lot to do with that. It proved we could do outer space sequences in a realistic way. But while Kubrick dreamed of space travel, other people had a less optimistic view of the future.
God save Mrs. Ethel Schroek. Long live Mrs. Ethel Schroek. God save Mrs. Ethel Schrock of 393A High Street, Leytonstone.
Bedsitting Room is an extremely underrated dark comedy from Britain. It starred some of the biggest names in British comedy at the time and is just really funny. The film takes place after a nuclear apocalypse where normal people attempt to go about their lives in a nuclear wasteland. One bit involves a man from the BBC going door to door, or rather person to person, to read them the news. In 1969, PBS first started broadcasting. I think this one's a stretch, but I needed a lead-in to TV, and I just really like Bedsitting Room. The Public Broadcasting Service is a not-for-profit television station in the US, which showed television shows with a specific focus on education, without the need for advertisements. The specific functions of the PBS are way too complicated to explain in a concise manner. Like, I'm a radio TV major, and the PBS was an entire chapter in our TV programming textbook. But if you grew up in America, you probably have an idea of what they're like, and similar institutions exist in other countries. Along with the PBS, we got some of their classic shows. Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, originally a show for PBS's predecessor, National Education Network, began airing in February of 1968. Sesame Street, a show that runs to this day, began airing in November of '69. Another franchise that still exists today is Scooby-Doo, though it has been rebooted multiple times. It had its debut on CBS in September of '69. And loosely tying back to the British comedy troupe Monty Python debuted Monty Python's Flying Circus in October of '69. Many other noteworthy programs got their start in '68 and '69. The news program 60 Minutes, Hee Haw, HR Pufnstuf, The Brady Bunch. It was the end of '60s Batman, the original Star Trek, and the final Looney Tunes cartoon until the late '80s debuted. Of course, these are just some of the noteworthy events and ideas explored in the final days of the '60s. It also saw the debut of people like Mel Brooks and Woody Allen, both of whom released their first movies. Films like Planet of the Apes explored themes like our increasing disenfranchisement with government and religious institutions, as well as our particularly relevant fear of self-annihilation. It'd be hard to say any one year was the most culturally important in American history, but as it is, I think 1969 is a very strong contender. It ended a decade and started another like no year ever has. Until next time, I'm Matt, and have a good 2020.
Good night.